Hi everybody, welcome back to In the Mix. This is part 2 of 2 walkthrough/video manual for Syntronik version 1. Feel free to check the description area for a timeline that contains all the different chapters that are covered in this video. The effect panel for each individual part holds 5 insert effects that are used only for the selected part and not the instruments loaded to other 3 parts. All these effects are linked together in series, which means the output of the first effect on the left is plugged into the input of the next one, and so on. Clicking on the effect name at the top opens a drop-down menu. All effect units are grouped and organized within 6 main effect categories, which are amps, distortion, dynamics and EQ, modulation, reverb and delay, and filter. Every category contains a number of relevant effects. There's a brief description about each effect unit in the manual. I'll go ahead and load an overdrive effect from the distortion category. We can use the power button up here to bypass a loaded effect. We can also click on the effect name and select empty from the drop-down menu. This will completely remove the effect from the slot. Custom settings can be saved and recalled as presets for each effect. Clicking in this field at the bottom of each effect will display a list of presets. If the list is empty, that means there aren't any presets available for that particular effect. I'm gonna make a small change to the tone parameter. Click on this little icon down here and select Save As. I'll call it Preset 1. Now, if I make any changes to preset 1, I can either select Save, which will overwrite the current preset, select Delete, which will delete preset 1, or save the changes as a new preset. Now I have 2 presets for this effect that can be accessed from the list. Once a preset is deleted, it will no longer be displayed in the list. Lastly, we have the default option that restores all edited parameters back to the factory settings for the selected effect. Clicking on this icon that looks like MIDI events or a step sequencer will change the view mode to the Arpeggiator panel, which is available for all 4 parts. An arpeggiator can listen to a note or chord and create simple to complex arpeggio patterns based on a defined set of rules. In other words, we can feed it a single note or a chord, and arpeggiator will turn it into an interesting running arpeggiated pattern. Syntronik has a 32-step arpeggiator. We can drag this orange bar to specify the number of steps that are going to be included in the pattern. By clicking on these numbers, we can enable or disable each step. For example, this is an 8-step arpeggio with steps 2 and 6 disabled. The play button starts and stops arpeggiated playback. When stopped, incoming MIDI notes are passed through. When engaged, the play button is lit and will pulse at the rate of current tempo. There's 2 sync options available. When set to external, Syntronik will slave to the host tempo and transport control, and we won't be able to edit the BPM field here. But when it's set to internal, it disregards the host tempo and follows the tempo in the BPM field. Obviously, if we use Syntronik in standalone mode, external option won't be available. Once the play button is engaged, Arpeggiator will continue through all of the steps in the pattern. But as soon as we play the first MIDI note, either from a MIDI controller or MIDI track, that will restart the arpeggiator from the beginning. I'm gonna play some notes and you'll see how incoming MIDI notes force the arpeggiator to restart from step 1. If notes are played legato, the arpeggiator will play the entire pattern before it goes back to step 1 again. But if notes are not connected, That will also re-trigger the arpeggiator each time there is a space between notes. Right now, each step is assigned to trigger a single note, so even if I play a chord, we would still hear one note at a time. We can also enable the chord icon that looks like 3 small circles beneath the step numbers and assign a full chord to a step. This way, the arpeggiator can generate more interesting patterns by combining single notes and chords. So now, steps 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7 are going to play single notes, while steps 2 and 6 are disabled and they're gonna be silent, and step 8 is going to play a full chord. Now let's talk about note value and note velocity. Each step can have its own length and velocity value. Vertical adjustments change the velocity value. We can drag the top edge up and down or click anywhere within the step. We can also click and drag to make changes for multiple steps at once. Depending on the selected preset, higher steps or velocity values could produce louder and brighter notes. Horizontal adjustments change the length of the step from the shortest length, which is a 30-second note, to the longest, which is a full bar. If we drag a note from one step over to the next step, it will automatically turn into a musical tie. If the adjacent note is a rest or disabled step, it would also become active and turned into a tie as well. Then we have the latch function. With latch mode off, as soon as we release the keys, the arpeggio will stop. With latch mode on, we can just play a note or chord and the pattern will continue to play until latch is turned off. With latch mode on, if we play new notes while the arpeggio is running, old notes will be released and replaced with the new notes. Steps 2 and 6 are disabled and considered musical rests, so I'll go ahead and bring down their velocity values as they're supposed to be silent steps. From the field above each step, we can select the transposition value for each individual step. The transposition range is from -12 to +12 semitones. This is the pattern without any transposition added. This time, I'm going to add some transposition values to steps 5 and 7, so the notes for these two steps are going to be transposed by +5 and +12 semitones. As you can see, we can add more variation to the pattern by transposing the steps. At the bottom of the interface, we have the velocity, length, and swing controls that set global playback parameters. There's 2 different velocity values that can influence the overall dynamic of the arpeggiator. One is the velocity value assigned to a step in the step editor, and one is the value assigned to incoming MIDI notes. The default value for this parameter is 50%. With the parameter set to 100%, the incoming MIDI notes control the velocity and dynamics of the pattern. With the parameter set to 0%, the velocity values in the step editor control the dynamics of the arpeggiated notes. We can set the pattern velocity knob to anywhere between 0 and 100% and blend the dynamic information from incoming notes and the step velocities. If we wanted to shorten or lengthen the duration for all steps by a percentage, then we can use the overall length parameter. The default value is 60% with a minimum value of 20% and a maximum value of 100%. Swing parameter can tighten or loosen the synchronization of the arpeggiator. It changes the timing and duration for every second note relative to the nearest downbeat, and it adds a swing feel to the pattern. Let's check it out. Here we can set the keyboard range boundaries for the arpeggiator. We can either do it by entering the notes manually or by dragging and adjusting the orange bar. Any note that is played outside the boundaries will bypass the arpeggiator, but those that are played within the highlighted area will trigger the arpeggiator. This is a very useful feature in case you wanted to create a split and play regular notes along with an arpeggiated pattern. For the notes that enter the arpeggiator, there's 4 different trigger modes available. This feature is particularly important if we're playing multiple arpeggiated parts that need to play back and stay in sync. Now is the default trigger mode, and it doesn't quantize incoming MIDI notes. 16th, beat, and bar quantize incoming MIDI notes in real time to the next 16th, next beat, or next bar. In other words, trigger mode controls and quantizes performance of MIDI notes played live via a MIDI controller or from a MIDI track based on the selected note value. Depending on the tempo and complexity of the arpeggios, you might want to experiment with these settings. At the top of the interface, we have the pattern rate, pattern octave, and arpeggio mode. The pattern rate setting changes the note resolution of the pattern and determines the time value of each step. The default value is 16th note. Obviously, the smaller the note value, the faster the arpeggiator will run. T stands for triplet, and D stands for dotted, so triplet and dotted notes are available as well. The pattern octave is another feature that we could use to add more variation to the arpeggio. There's 4 patterns available which transpose some of the notes an octave higher based on the octave value. The arpeggio mode determines how the arpeggiator is going to cycle through the notes played. Each mode has a unique pre-programmed order of notes and can be changed or selected in real time while the arpeggio is playing. There are 7 arpeggio modes available that are pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I'd like to add is that in chord mode, all steps are automatically turned into chord steps regardless of their current status. Let's take a listen. If you wanted to clear and reset all data in the step editor, you can go ahead and click the Clear button. Just remember that this function cannot be undone, so if you're not certain, you might want to save your pattern first. This is the Arpeggiator Pattern Management area. To save a pattern for the first time, click on this icon and select Save As. The pattern will be saved in the Syntronik's Arpeggios subfolder. Now, if we click the Pattern Management icon again, we'll get three options from the drop-down menu. Save will overwrite the currently selected pattern. Save As will save as a new pattern in case you wanted to save the original one or if you just wanted to create a new pattern. Now, if we click the Arpeggio name field, a list of all available patterns will show. Delete will remove the selected pattern from the disk. To load a pattern, we can just select one from the list. The patterns listed here are available to be used with other presets as well. I'll go ahead and load a different preset and apply this pattern. Clicking the lock icon next to the pattern name field locks the current arpeggiator pattern, which prevents another arpeggiator pattern from loading if it is part of an instrument. This lets you maintain the current pattern while still loading new instruments that have patterns saved with them. Clicking on this icon that has 4 horizontal lines will take us to the layer panel. Syntronik is a 4-part instrument labeled as A, B, C, and D. Each part is considered an independent instrument with its own effect and arpeggiator section. The collection of 4 parts with their instruments, effects, and arpeggios is called a layer. Layers are saved as separate objects which contains the individual settings and details for all parts that are saved within the layer. Entire layer always responds to a single MIDI channel, which means we can play a note on the keyboard or use a single MIDI track to trigger the entire layer. Once different parts are saved as a layer, we will no longer be able to access individual parts with different MIDI channels. To select a part, we can either click the letters either at the top of the interface or in the center of the layer panel. The selected part is always highlighted. I'll go ahead and load presets for each part. Right now, all 4 parts are set to a full range keyboard, which means if I play a note, all 4 presets will play together. We can adjust the playable note range by entering the low key and high key manually. Or we can drag the orange bar above the keyboard for each part. These independent note range settings will limit the playable range for each instrument. Here we can also create velocity layered instruments. This would allow us to use incoming note velocity range to trigger certain instruments. For example, I can have Synth A respond to all velocities, Synth B to velocity range between 50 and 70, Synth C only to higher velocities above 100, and Synth D only to soft velocities below 30. Here below the letter names, we have the layer management area. To save all instruments loaded in this panel as a layer, click the toast icon here and select Save As. Once the layer is saved, it'll show in the layer name field. If we make changes to an existing layer and select Save, that will overwrite the currently selected layer. Selecting Save As will save the edits as a new layer, which can also be accessed from the Layer Management field. Delete will completely remove the selected layer from the disk and will no longer show in the layer name field. To load a layer, we can just select one from the list, which will replace the currently selected layer. The next 2 options from the drop-down menu are Reset and Initialize. Reset keeps the existing instruments loaded in all 4 parts, but resets the keyboard and velocity ranges to full range. Initialize removes all of the loaded instruments and their custom keyboard and velocity range. So Initialize does not remove the layer from the disk, but just empties all parts. There's a lock icon next to the instrument name for each part. With the lock icon enabled, if we select a new layer, the locked part will remain unchanged while new instruments are being loaded into the other parts. Aside from key and velocity range, each part can also have independent volume and pan settings as well. We can access them by clicking on the mixer icon in the menu bar. This master volume is global and controls the overall output for Syntronik. However, here we can adjust the volume and pan settings for each part. First, we would need to select the part and then apply volume and pan adjustments. These parameters can be saved with the layer. And as you can see, each part can have independent pan and volume settings. We can also mute or solo the part by clicking the mute and solo icons. The letters for the muted or soloed parts change color accordingly, which makes it easy to see the status for each part. If we're not recording anything and there's no need for a DAW and other third-party softwares, we can use Syntronik in Standalone Mode. This mode will require us to select the audio device and configure the MIDI settings. I'll go ahead and launch Syntronik as a standalone instrument for the first time. Clicking the settings icon opens the setting window. Here at the top, we have 5 tabs available. Before I go over the options for the audio MIDI tab, I gotta say that these settings entirely depend on the audio and MIDI devices that you use with your computers. Technology lists all compatible audio drivers that are available on your computer. Generally, for best performance with lowest latency, you'd want to select the Nasio driver for PC and a Core Audio driver for Mac computers. On this computer, I have 2 generic Windows audio drivers as well as 1 Audio driver available. From Output Device, we can select the audio hardware that is connected to the computer. I'm using a Zen Studio audio interface. Depending on the selected audio hardware, we can set the Syntronik's left and right output to a specific channel. Sample rate and buffer size are another 2 important options. As you can see, my audio interface supports various sample rates, but for live performance, 44.1 or 48K is optimal as they give enough CPU headroom for background tasks. Depending on how the samples were recorded, much higher sample rates may or may not offer an audible difference. Since not all audio interfaces offer the same buffer settings, it's hard to make a specific comment. However, in general, the best setting would be the lowest buffer size without hearing clicks and pops. I normally use 256 as a starting point. In my case, if I wanted to change the buffer setting, I would have to go to the software control panel that comes with the Zen Studio and change the buffer there first. Then that buffer setting will become available for Syntronik. For MIDI settings, we can use the MIDI input option to select the MIDI input device. If you want Syntronik to respond to all MIDI devices that are connected to the computer, then leave it to any, which is the default setting. Or we can select a specific device and Syntronik will respond to that device only. If MIDI channel is set to Omni, Syntronik will respond to incoming MIDI information on all MIDI channels, but we can also dedicate a specific MIDI channel to Syntronik as well. Under the Library tab, we can change the library path to a new directory. If you own Sample Tank 3, the Syntronik Sound Content disk path must match the Sample Tank 3 disk path, as you can load Syntronik sounds in Sample Tank 3 as well. Under Program Change tab, we can assign a MIDI program change number to our user-saved layers. Then we can use a physical control on a MIDI controller to remotely select these layers. This is especially useful for live performance when using a mouse is not convenient or practical. I've already created 3 user layers. Here I can assign each layer to a program change number. They don't have to be listed in a particular order, but we do need to keep track of their assignments. I'll assign my test layer to program change 0, piano layer to program change 1, and strings to program change 2. Here I have a Korg NanoPad 2, which is a USB plug-and-play MIDI controller. It comes with the Korg Control Editor software, which I've used to assign the first top 3 trigger pads to the same program change messages for my user layers. Now I could simply hit a pad and load a layer without using the mouse. Under Remote tab, we can assign MIDI-CC messages to additional Syntronik functions, and then we can use a physical control to remotely control those functions. Because these are not on-off type of messages, you would normally want to assign them to a knob or fader. This time I'll use an Akai Advanced MIDI controller. There are 3 options available: Browse Parts, Browse Sounds, and Load Selected Sound. Here we can assign each function to a MIDI-CC message. Always make sure to use a CC message that is not already assigned to a different function. I'll assign them to CC3, CC4, and CC5. I've also assigned the first 3 knobs on the MIDI controller to the same CC messages. So now knob 1 browses through parts A, B, C, and D. Knob 2 browses instruments, and knob 3 loads the selected sound. Finally, under Info tab, we can view information about the currently installed version of Syntronik. This concludes Syntronik version 1 video manual, and hopefully you've enjoyed and found these 2 videos useful. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks again for joining us, and tune in next time as we dive into the sounds and presets of this exciting synthesizer. See you next time!